Okay, so in this chapter, we will be looking at learning. So we'll be, as usual, defining what we mean by that, and then we're going to be looking at four specific types of learning. So we'll be focusing primarily on classical and operant conditioning, and then we'll briefly at the end look at observational learning and cognitive learning. But first, let's start by defining what we mean by learning. Now, usually when we think of learning, we think of formal methods of acquiring new knowledge or skills, such as learning in a classroom, learning to play an instrument, learning a sport. So it's explicit, conscious attempts at learning something formally. However, within psychology, the topic of learning is much broader than that. So the definition we have for learning is that it is a relatively permanent change in behavior or knowledge resulting from experience. So, through our experiences, we acquire new skills and new knowledge, either consciously or unconsciously. Most importantly, for the type of learning we will be looking at, we learn patterns. We notice patterns. We notice associations between things in our environment. We notice that there are consequences to our behaviors. And as you learn these skills and you notice these kinds of patterns, they are ultimately leading to changes in your brain. So when we talk about this relatively permanent change in behavior, that is also the result of these changes that are occurring in the brain. So for example, as we learn to drive, neurons start forming new connections and start altering networks in the brain. So every time you take a driving lesson, those new networks of neurons will become stronger and stronger and stronger until eventually your brain can take over and engage in automatic processing, where you can get in your car and your brain processes all of the information it needs to without you really thinking about it. And you can drive without having to really consciously put effort into what you are doing, because your brain has learned how to drive. You have learned how to drive. Now that can happen very quickly. Some learning takes time, some learning's conscious, some learning's unconscious. Learning to drive is conscious. We are explicitly making that decision to learn to drive. We are putting the effort in. Same with schoolwork. You are trying to learn new information. You are trying to store new information. But there are examples of unconscious forms of learning. In fact, most of what we'll be looking at is unconscious learning in this chapter. So if any of you have a fear of spiders or some other kind of animal from childhood that you fear, unless you remember an experience where you maybe got bitten by a spider, or something happened to create that fear, chances are that you learned that unconsciously, and we'll be looking at ways that fear may have developed without you consciously being aware of that happening. The main point is that through this learning, in whatever form it takes, our knowledge expands or alters, and we either acquire new behaviors or we modify our existing ones to allow us to adapt and cope with our surroundings. Now, most of what we're looking at is a type of learning called associative learning or conditioning. So associative learning is when organisms make connections between stimuli or events that occur together in the environment. So as we discuss these types of conditioning, we're referring to this process of learning associations between different events and behaviors that occur together. So that could be learning that a behavior leads to a certain consequence. So that would be operant conditioning, or learning the connections between external events, such as, when you hear the doorbell, you know that means someone is at the door. You have to learn that. So we will primarily be looking at those two types of conditioning in this chapter.